Have you ever noticed how the most important moments in our lives rarely announce themselves? They do not arrive with crashing thunder or bright flashing lights. Instead, they slip in quietly, often, late at night, when the rest of the world is fast asleep. They come disguised as ordinary, forgettable moments. A cold wind blowing across an empty highway. A flickering neon sign buzzing with a faint electric hum. Or a simple, desperate request from a complete stranger. For Leo Vance, the moment that would alter the course of his entire life and finally heal a wound he had carried for over a decade started with nothing more than a cup of burnt, lukewarm coffee. It was late November in the year 2004, Red Rock Springs. Arizona was the kind of town people usually just drove straight through. It was a dusty, forgotten stretch of land, completely surrounded by miles and miles of empty desert. At 2 o'clock in the morning, the freezing desert wind howled outside. It threw handfuls of loose sand straight against the large glass windows of the Starlight Diner. The sound was sharp and relentless. Inside, however, it was warm. The air smelled intensely of old frying oil, harsh bleach, and cheap vanilla syrup. The diner was a relic of the past, stuck in a quiet time loop. The red vinyl seats were cracked, heavily patched with layers of silver duct tape. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered constantly, casting long, nervous shadows right across the black and white checkered floor. Leo sat alone, tucked away in the far corner booth, his broad back facing the wall. It was an old habit he had picked up years ago, a silent way to always keep an eye on the front door. He was a large, deeply imposing man. His shoulders were wide, wrapped tightly in a heavy, scuffed leather jacket. The leather was faded at the elbows, telling quiet stories of thousands of miles spent alone on the open road. His hands were rough, heavily calloused, and permanently stained with the dark, stubborn grease of the engines he fixed for a living. His face was lined with age and deep exhaustion. A thick, graying beard hid the sharp angles of his jaw. To the rare late-night traveler, Leo looked like a genuine threat. He looked like the kind of man you absolutely did not make eye contact with. He was the kind of man people crossed the street to avoid, and honestly, Leo preferred it that way. Isolation was not just a preference for Leo, it was a necessary shield. He picked up his white ceramic mug, taking another slow, deliberate sip of his coffee. It tasted incredibly bitter, almost like ash, but he drank it anyway. The harsh caffeine kept him awake, and keeping awake kept his dark memories at bay. Tonight was a particularly difficult night. The cold air was biting, and the memories were much sharper than usual. Today was the exact anniversary of the day he lost his younger sister, Maya. 10 long, agonizing years had passed, but the guilt still sat heavy in his chest, feeling exactly like a cold, jagged stone. Maya had been young, vibrant, and full of life, but she had been trapped in a terrible, highly violent relationship. It was a toxic relationship she kept hidden, smiling through the pain until it was entirely too late. Leo had promised to get her out to drive his battered truck to her city and to bring her back home, right where she belonged. But he had hesitated. He had waited one day too long, thinking he had more time. By the time he reached her small, run-down apartment all those years ago, the absolute worst had already happened. Sitting in the quiet diner, Leo closed his eyes, and he could still see the flashing red and blue police lights. He could still hear the harsh, crackling static of the police radios cutting through the night air. The crushing, suffocating realization that he had failed to protect the one person he loved most, it had completely broken him. That memory was a dark ghost, a relentless phantom that haunted him every single time the world went quiet. It was the exact reason he rode his motorcycle across empty highways, pushing the heavy engine, to its absolute limits, desperately trying to outrun a tragic past that was always riding right there on his shoulder. He swallowed hard, pushing the painful thought down deep, and stared blankly at the scratched wooden table in front of him. The diner was almost entirely empty now. The late-night crowd had completely thinned out, leaving nothing but empty sugar packets and crumpled napkins behind. The only other person in the room was a young waitress named Betty. She was standing behind the long counter, wiping it down with a damp cloth. The wet rag made a soft, rhythmic slapping sound against the smooth formica surface. Betty was used to Leo. He came in almost every single Tuesday night, ordered his black coffee, maybe a slice of cherry pie, and sat perfectly quietly for hours. She knew he was not a dangerous man, despite the worn leather jacket, the heavy boots, and the intense stare. She walked over to his booth, holding a steaming glass pot of fresh coffee. "Warm that up for you, Leo?" she asked, her voice soft, but clearly tired from a long, exhausting 12-hour shift. Leo looked up, offering a slow, polite nod. "Yes, please. Thank you, Betty," he replied. His voice deep slightly, gravelly but surprisingly gentle. She poured the dark, steaming liquid into his mug, the hot steam rising up quickly between them. "Quiet night out there," Betty noted, looking past him out the large, dusty window toward the pitch-black highway. "Almost too quiet. The wind is really picking up, though. The radio said it is supposed to drop way below freezing by morning." Leo simply nodded again, wrapping his large hands around the warm mug. He did not mind the cold weather at all. The cold made sense to him. It was honest, and it was predictable. Betty smiled slightly, fully understanding his deep need for absolute silence, and she walked slowly back to the kitchen, leaving him entirely alone with his thoughts once more. He reached deeply into his jacket pocket, pulling out a heavy silver pocket watch. It was completely broken. The delicate hands were permanently stuck at 3:15, the exact devastating time he had received the tragic phone call about his sister. He ran his rough thumb over the smooth, scratched metal surface, using the familiar texture to ground himself in the present moment. He took a long, deep breath, telling himself once again to let the past go. There was nothing he could change now. It was time to head home, back to his empty, quiet house. He reached into his wallet, pulled out a crisp $5 bill, and placed it neatly on the table. He prepared to slide out of the tight vinyl booth. He gathered his heavy motorcycle keys, the metal clinking softly but sharply in the quiet room. He was finally ready to walk out into the freezing desert air, start his loud motorcycle, and completely disappear into the dark night. But just as he placed his hand on the edge of the table to stand up, the small brass bell above the diner's front door let out a sharp, sudden jingle. It was a completely normal sound, something he had heard at least a dozen times tonight. But this time, for some unexplainable reason, the very air in the room seemed to instantly shift. The diner went perfectly, absolutely still. Even Betty, who was loudly stacking ceramic dishes behind the counter, stopped moving completely. Leo did not look up right away. He kept his eyes locked on his keys. He was not a man who paid attention to other people's business. He had learned a very long time ago that stepping into other people's problems usually just made things far worse. Quiet meant no trouble, and no trouble meant survival. But the silence that followed the ringing bell was incredibly heavy. It was thick, dripping with a strange, nervous hesitation. Someone was standing right in the doorway, bringing the freezing wind inside with them, but they were not moving forward. Finally drawn by a deep protective instinct, he could not quite explain. Leo slowly raised his eyes and looked toward the door. When Leo finally raised his eyes, he saw her. She was standing just inside the heavy glass door. The biting desert wind had followed her inside, swirling angrily around the hem of her long wool skirt. She looked entirely out of place. She was an elderly woman, perhaps in her late 70s. She was dressed neatly, wearing a pale blue cardigan and perfectly pressed trousers. She looked like a woman who belonged in a sunny Sunday church pew or sitting quietly in a warm, fragrant library. She absolutely did not belong in a rundown roadside diner at 2 o'clock in the morning on a freezing Tuesday. Her white hair was pinned back neatly and carefully, but a few loose strands had escaped, blown wildly across her face by the harsh wind. Her hands, thin and fragile, gripped the thick strap of her leather purse. She held it tightly against her chest, as if her entire life depended on it. Leo narrowed his eyes, watching her carefully from the dark shadows of his corner booth. He noticed the stark whiteness of her knuckles. She was gripping the purse so hard, her hands were actually trembling. Inside that purse, hidden deep beneath old grocery receipts and mints, was a worn leather-bound book. And tucked safely inside that book was her secret, a one-way bus ticket to Albuquerque. It was a ticket she had bought 6 months ago, representing a desperate, silent wish for freedom. But right now she was not thinking about the ticket. She was actively looking out the window. Margaret Thornton took a slow, shallow breath. The warm air of the diner hit her cold face, carrying the sharp smell of old coffee. She offered a polite, trembling smile to Betty. Betty smiled back instantly, wiping her wet hands on her apron. "Take a seat anywhere, honey," Betty called out softly, her voice full of simple kindness. "Can I get you something warm?" Margaret nodded gently, her voice barely a whisper. "Just a cup of hot water, please, with a little lemon if you have it." She moved away from the door, but she did not walk far into the diner. She chose a small circular table right next to the large front window. It was a terrible spot to sit. It was drafty cold, and it offered absolutely no privacy, but it gave her a clear, unobstructed view of the dark, empty parking lot outside. She sat down stiffly, keeping her thick woolen coat buttoned up high around her neck. She placed her heavy purse squarely on her lap, never letting go of the leather strap. Leo watched her quietly, his rugged expression completely unreadable. He remained perfectly still in his old booth. He was a master mechanic, a man who fixed broken, complicated things for a living. He knew exactly how to look at a machine and instantly spot the hidden problem. He looked at people in the exact same way. And right now, looking at this fragile, polite woman, all of his internal warning alarms were ringing loudly. Margaret turned her head slightly, looking out through the dusty, scratched glass. The diner parking lot was very large and very poorly lit. Only 2 tall street lamps were actually working tonight. They cast long, weak pools of yellow light onto the cracked, uneven asphalt. Beyond that fading light was pure, heavy darkness. Margaret stared deeply into that darkness, her pale eyes wide and terrified. She was not just looking at the empty space. She was actively searching for something, or perhaps someone. She reached up nervously, adjusting the soft collar of her cardigan. The movement was quick and jerky. Leo noticed the sudden way she flinched when the diner's old refrigerator suddenly kicked on with a loud buzzing hum. She was incredibly jumpy. She was clearly a woman carrying a heavy invisible weight on her small shoulders. She was a woman measuring real risk with every single passing second. Betty walked over slowly, placing a small white mug of hot water on Margaret's table. "Here you go, ma'am. Careful now, it is very hot." "Thank you, dear," Margaret said, her voice shaking slightly. She reached for the warm mug, her thin fingers trembling in the cold air. She brought it up to her lips, but she did not drink a single drop. Her eyes immediately darted back to the dark window. Leo leaned back heavily in his booth, the old vinyl creaking loudly beneath his weight. He firmly told himself to look away. He told himself it was absolutely none of his business. People had their own complicated lives and their own terrible messes. His painful past had taught him a brutal, unforgiving lesson. Stepping into someone else's darkness usually just brought the darkness right to your own front door. He picked up his heavy motorcycle keys again, gripping the cold, sharp metal tightly. It was finally time to leave. He slid out of the tight booth, his heavy steel-toed boots hitting the floor with a dull, solid thud. The sound was surprisingly loud in the quiet diner. Margaret flinched violently, again turning her head sharply toward the sound. For a brief, fleeting second, their eyes met across the room. Leo stopped moving instantly. He stood perfectly frozen, right in the middle of the narrow aisle. Margaret's eyes were pale blue, entirely framed by deep, dark circles of exhaustion. But it was not the deep exhaustion that stopped him in his tracks. It was the absolute raw fear he saw there. It was a terrible look he recognized instantly. It was the exact same look his sister Maya had given him the very last time he saw her alive. It was the tragic look of a trapped animal, desperately hoping for a way out, but completely terrified to make a move. Margaret quickly broke the intense eye contact. She looked down rapidly at her hot water, her pale cheeks flushing with a deep, embarrassed pink. She pulled her cardigan much tighter around her small shoulders, trying desperately to make herself look as small as possible. She was actively trying to disappear. Leo felt a sharp, deeply painful ache in his chest. His logical mind screamed at him to walk away. Walk right out the front door, get on the loud bike, and ride far into the empty desert. He took a heavy, determined step toward the exit. The glass front door was only 10 feet away. He could clearly feel the freezing cold draft slipping in under the metal frame. He just had to keep walking forward. He passed closely by her small table. He was close enough to clearly hear her shallow, ragged breathing. He was close enough to smell the faint, clean scent of lavender soap and old paper. He kept his dark eyes locked strictly on the door. He pushed the heavy glass open. The freezing wind instantly biting hard into his face. He stepped outside onto the cold concrete walkway. He was out. He was completely clear. But as he stood there, alone in the freezing air, the heavy diner door slowly swinging shut behind him, he stopped entirely. He could not take another single step toward his motorcycle. The tragic image of her pale, terrified eyes burned brightly in his mind. He clenched his jaw tightly, his large hands curling into tight, angry fists. He knew exactly what was waiting for a woman like her out here in the dark. He knew the terrible kind of monsters that actively hunted in the shadows. He stood there motionless for a long moment, the relentless wind tearing at his leather jacket. Then, slowly, heavily, he turned his head and looked back through the large glass window. Margaret was still sitting right there. She was staring blankly at his empty booth, looking more lost and more alone than anyone he had ever seen in his life. She looked down at her heavy purse, her thin fingers lightly tracing the worn leather. She was thinking deeply about her secret ticket. She was thinking about finally leaving. But she was entirely paralyzed by her own fear. Margaret's mind was a chaotic, terrifying storm of thoughts. She thought heavily about her son Thomas. She thought about the heavy, angry way his footsteps always sounded on the hardwood floor. She thought about the mounting, terrifying pile of final notice bills on the kitchen counter, and the sharp, cruel way his voice dropped right before he lost his temper completely. She had slipped quietly out of the house tonight, while he was passed out heavily on the living room sofa. She had desperately needed just a few moments of peace, a few moments to breathe, without feeling perfectly terrified. But now she had to go back. She had to cross that dark, empty parking lot, get into her old, unreliable car, and drive back to her own personal prison. She looked up at the small, round clock on the diner wall. It was almost 2:30 in the morning. Thomas would wake up very soon. If he found her missing, his violent rage would be entirely unbearable. She had to leave right now. She had to move. She slowly stood up, her old knees aching sharply from the cold. She left a single crumpled dollar bill on the table for Betty. She gripped her heavy purse tightly, pulling her thin coat tight around her frail body. She walked slowly toward the front door, every single step feeling incredibly heavy. Leo watched her intently from outside. He watched her approach the glass door. He did not move away. He stood firmly on the concrete walkway, his large frame actively blocking the harsh, biting wind. Margaret pushed the heavy door open. The small bell jingled sharply again. She stepped out into the freezing night air, instantly shivering. She looked up and gasped softly. Leo was standing right there. He was a giant, intimidating figure, entirely cloaked in dark leather and deep shadows. She froze completely, her fragile heart pounding furiously against her ribs. She tightened her grip on her purse instinctively, taking a small step back. She was a small, fragile woman, entirely alone in the dark, with a large, dangerous-looking stranger. Leo did not move toward her. He kept his hands clearly visible, resting loosely at his sides. He softened his rigid posture, trying hard to look as non-threatening as a man his size possibly could. He waited patiently, letting the heavy silence stretch between them. The wind howled loudly, pushing empty coffee cups across the dark asphalt. Margaret looked past his wide shoulders, staring out at her old blue sedan. It was parked at the very far edge of the lot, completely hidden in the deep black shadows. The short walk from the bright diner to that dark car suddenly felt like 1,000,000 miles. The darkness looked entirely suffocating. She swallowed hard, her throat feeling incredibly dry. She looked back up at Leo's face. She saw the deep lines of weariness etched deeply into his skin. She saw the dark grease stained into his hands. She saw a man who looked exactly like the rest of the rough, unforgiving world. But underneath his harsh exterior, she saw something else too. She saw a quiet, steady stillness. She saw someone who was not walking away. For a brief, desperate second, Margaret thought about the hidden bus ticket in her purse. She thought about finally taking a chance. She gathered every single ounce of courage she had left in her frail body. She took a small, shaky breath and looked directly into Leo's dark eyes. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her voice soft, but incredibly brave. The words hung suspended tightly in the freezing desert air. Leo remained perfectly still. For a brief, highly confusing second, he genuinely thought he had misheard her. The howling wind was incredibly loud outside, aggressively whipping the loose sand right against the glass door. He slowly looked down, meeting her pale, terrified eyes. She was looking directly at him. She was not looking past him or looking away in absolute disgust. She was looking right into his dark, tired eyes. Leo Vance was a man who was entirely used to being invisible. He was a deeply solitary man who was actively avoided by the rest of the world. He knew exactly what he looked like to polite society. He looked like a rough, unforgiving, and violent threat. When he walked down the narrow aisles of the local grocery store, young mothers instinctively pulled their children much closer. When he pulled his loud, heavy motorcycle into a gas station late at night, the attendants quickly and nervously locked their glass doors. People judged him instantly, making harsh, rapid assumptions about his entire character long before he ever spoke a single word. He was simply a dark, imposing shadow, a lonely ghost, heavily covered in black engine grease and scuffed, faded leather. Yet here was this fragile, elderly woman. She was standing right in front of him, looking up at him, as if he were a safe harbor, rather than a dangerous approaching storm. "Would you mind walking me to my car?" she asked again. The simple words tumbled out of her mouth in a quiet, desperate, and breathless rush. It was as if she truly feared she might lose her fragile courage entirely if she waited even 1 second longer. Leo stared at her, his expression completely unreadable. He saw the faint, uncontrollable tremble in her thin hands. He noticed the careful, rigid politeness in her posture. She looked exactly like someone who had practiced asking for help 1,000 times in the mirror, desperately trying not to sound like an annoying burden. He swallowed hard, the bitter taste of cold, cheap coffee still lingering in his mouth. He was absolutely not used to this. People simply did not ask him for help. They ran away from him. They hid from him behind locked doors. But this older woman, she had looked right past the heavy leather and the dark dirt. She had seen something else entirely, or perhaps she was simply entirely out of other safer options. Either way, Leo did not hesitate for another second. He gave a slow, deep, confirming nod. "Yeah," he said, his voice incredibly deep, but surprisingly gentle. "I got you." A sudden profound flash of pure relief instantly washed over Margaret's pale, lined face. It was a quick, genuine expression, completely stripping away her practiced, polite smile. She nodded back at him, pulling her thick woolen coat much tighter around her neck. She took a slow, deep breath of the freezing air, pushed the heavy glass door open, and stepped fully out onto the dark concrete walkway. Leo shifted his heavy stance immediately. He stepped down off the curb, moving smoothly and quietly to her left side. He deliberately positioned his massive frame squarely between her and the open, dark highway. It was an old, deeply ingrained protective habit. It was a quiet, desperate instinct, born from years of trying to shield his late sister Maya from a cruel, highly dangerous world. They began to walk together slowly, stepping into the vast, poorly lit parking lot. The diner parking lot was incredibly large, heavily cracked, and completely covered in loose, sharp desert gravel. Every single step they took made a loud, sharp crunching sound. The sudden noise echoed loudly, bouncing right off the dark, empty cars scattered around the lot. Margaret walked with very careful, highly deliberate steps. Her thin, sensible shoes tapped rhythmically right against the broken asphalt. She was trying desperately to carefully balance her deep need for physical safety with her own fierce sense of personal independence. She stayed close to Leo, but not entirely too close. Leo immediately adjusted his own long strides. He slowed his walking pace drastically. He made absolutely sure to never walk faster than her. He stayed right by her side, acting as a silent, imposing guardian in the freezing dark. He did not speak a single word. He did not rush her movements. He simply walked. Margaret kept her arms crossed tightly over her chest, holding her heavy leather purse firmly against her ribs. Inside that old bag, tucked safely inside a worn leather-bound book, the secret bus ticket felt incredibly heavy. It felt exactly like a glowing hot ember pressing right against her side. She had walked this terrible dark path alone so many times before. She had spent countless years quietly and painfully navigating the terrifying shadows of her own miserable life. Having this giant, silent stranger walking right beside her felt completely foreign and entirely unexpected. But as she listened to the solid, heavy thud of his steel-toed boots against the gravel, she realized something profound. For the first time in a very long time, she did not feel entirely defenseless. Leo kept his dark eyes incredibly sharp. He constantly scanned the dark, empty corners of the lot. He watched the deep black shadows stretching long between the parked cars. The cold desert wind whipped aggressively around them, carrying the bitter, dry smell of dead sagebrush and freezing dust. The two working streetlights flickered erratically, buzzing loudly and annoyingly overhead. They cast long, highly distorted shadows across the uneven, broken ground. Margaret's shadow looked incredibly small, completely swallowed up by Leo's massive dark silhouette. As they reached the absolute middle of the empty lot, the bright neon lights of the Starlight Diner were now far behind them. The silence between them was incredibly thick, but it was absolutely not uncomfortable. It was a heavy, shared, quiet understanding. Words were completely unnecessary right now. They were simply just two lonely, deeply broken people walking together through a freezing, unforgiving night. Margaret looked straight ahead, focusing her tired, watery eyes on her old, faded blue sedan. It was parked at the very far edge of the lot, completely surrounded by absolute, suffocating darkness. That car was her only way home. It was the only way back to her angry, bitter son, Thomas. It was the only way back to the loud yelling, the violent slamming of doors, and the terrifying, unpredictable outbursts that haunted her daily life. The closer they got to that old broken-down car, the more incredibly anxious Margaret became. Her steps became slightly more hesitant and much slower. Her breathing grew incredibly shallow and rapid. She absolutely did not want to go back to that house. She desperately wanted to turn around, run down the dark, empty highway, and find the nearest brightly lit bus station. She wanted to eagerly pull that hidden ticket from her purse and completely disappear into the night, leaving Thomas far behind forever. But the heavy rusted chains of fear and a deeply twisted sense of motherly duty kept her feet moving forward, dragging her painfully back to her own personal prison. Leo noticed the sudden slight change in her pace immediately. He noticed the exact way her small, fragile shoulders tensed up, rising rigidly toward her ears. He saw the tight, nervous grip she had on her purse strap. He did not say anything, but he filed every single detail away in his sharp mind. He was a master mechanic. He knew exactly what it sounded like when a failing engine was hesitating. He knew exactly what it looked like when a fragile person was hesitating too. They were almost at the car now. The darkness right here was absolute, entirely untouched by the distant buzzing streetlights. The wind howled furiously, tearing violently across the open, flat desert. Margaret reached out her trembling fingers nervously, searching the dark depths of her purse, looking desperately for her cold metal car keys. Leo stood nearby, keeping a very respectful, careful distance. He was just close enough to make absolutely sure she was completely safe, but far enough away to give her the personal space she clearly needed. He quietly watched her fumble with the keys, the metal jingling loudly in the quiet night. He mentally prepared himself to nod politely, say goodnight, and walk completely back to his solitary, lonely life. But the universe, it seemed, had a completely different, highly dramatic plan for both of them tonight. The harsh wind, which had been howling consistently, suddenly dropped entirely. For one brief, terrifying second, the world went completely, perfectly still. Then an incredibly violent, sudden gust of freezing wind swept fiercely across the dark parking lot. It hit Margaret hard, tearing aggressively at her thick woolen coat. She gasped softly, reaching up quickly with her right hand, trying desperately to hold her collar tight against her freezing neck. The sudden jerky movement combined with the fierce tearing wind pulled the long sleeve of her pale blue cardigan entirely backward. The soft fabric shifted dramatically, sliding completely up her thin, highly fragile forearm. It was only exposed for a brief, fleeting second, just long enough for the harsh reality to hit. And that is exactly when Leo Vance saw it. The soft blue wool pulled back sharply. The pale, fragile skin of her thin wrist was suddenly exposed to the cold, harsh light. And there, starkly painted against her pale flesh, were the dark, undeniable marks. They were deep, ugly bruises. They were wrapped tightly entirely around her delicate wrist. They were an angry mottled mix of deep purple, dark blue, and sickly yellow. They stood out vividly, screaming a terrible silent truth into the freezing night air. Leo stopped breathing just for a fraction of a second. His large, heavy boots ground to a complete sudden halt on the loose, sharp gravel. He did not gasp. He did not speak. But inside his broad chest, his heart pounded fiercely against his ribs. He had seen marks exactly like that many, many times before. He was a man who had lived a hard, unforgiving life. He knew the difference between a clumsy accident and a deliberate violent act. You do not get dark, perfect finger-shaped bruises from simply bumping into a kitchen table. You do not get deep, overlapping rings of purple trauma from slipping on a wet floor. Those marks were a clear, undeniable statement of sheer physical force. They were the vicious, lingering ghost of someone's cruel, uncontrolled rage. A sharp, painful memory instantly pierced through Leo's mind. He saw his sister Maya. He saw her sitting quietly on a cheap floral sofa. She was wearing a long-sleeved cotton shirt in the dead, suffocating heat of a scorching summer. He remembered the exact way she had carefully, nervously adjusted her cuffs. She had desperately tried to hide the dark, ugly truth from his protective eyes. He had failed her then. He had pretended not to notice. He had politely accepted her fragile, unconvincing lies. That single cowardly decision had haunted him every single day for 10 agonizing years. Margaret gasped sharply, a tiny, terrified sound escaping her pale lips. She realized instantly what had just happened. Panic, raw and completely unfiltered, flooded her exhausted eyes. She yanked her thin arm down with a sudden, violent jerk. She desperately pulled the soft blue fabric right back over the dark, damning bruises. She pulled the sleeve down so hard, she almost tore the delicate woolen threads. She quickly hugged her heavy purse tight against her chest again. She tried desperately to rebuild her fragile, invisible wall. She did not look up at Leo's face. She absolutely could not bear to see the pity or the disgust in his dark eyes. A deep, overwhelming sense of intense, burning shame washed entirely over her. She felt completely naked, totally exposed in the freezing desert wind. She had spent countless years carefully, meticulously hiding Thomas's dark, violent outbursts. She had worn long sleeves, heavy sweaters, and thick scarves. She had lied to her neighbors. She had lied to the grocery store clerks. She had even lied to her own broken heart. And now, in one single, careless second, a harsh gust of wind had completely destroyed her desperate protective illusion. I am so sorry," she stammered blindly, her voice shaking violently in the cold air. She turned her back completely to the large, imposing man. She focused all of her frantic, nervous energy entirely on the door handle of her old blue sedan. She shoved her trembling hand deep into her purse. She blindly searched for her cold metal keys. The sharp metal pieces jingled loudly and erratically as her fingers shook. She finally grasped them, pulling them out, with a jerky, uncoordinated motion. She thrust the small silver key into the frozen, rusted lock. The metal groaned loudly, resisting her weak, frantic turn. Leo stood perfectly still just a few feet away. He did not step closer. He did not crowd her tight, suffocating space. He simply watched her with a dark, intense, and unreadable expression. The freezing desert wind whipped aggressively around them again, but he did not feel the bitter cold. He only felt a rising, steady tide of quiet, righteous anger. It was not a hot, explosive anger. It was a cold, calculating, and deeply protective fury. It was the absolute certainty of a man who had finally decided to draw a hard, unforgiving line in the sand. The rusted lock finally clicked loudly. The heavy metallic sound echoed sharply in the vast, empty parking lot. Margaret pulled the heavy metal door handle. The car door opened smoothly, revealing the dark, cold interior of her old sedan. She quickly tossed her heavy purse onto the worn passenger seat. The worn leather-bound book shifted slightly inside, keeping her secret unused bus ticket entirely hidden. She stood there for one long, agonizing moment. The open car door offered her a clear, immediate escape. She could simply slide into the cold driver's seat. She could lock the heavy doors, start the old, noisy engine, and drive rapidly away into the dark night. She could go back to Thomas. She could go back to the yelling, the fear, and the dark bruises. She could completely forget that this giant, silent stranger had ever seen her dark, terrible secret. She took a slow, deep breath, desperately gathering her shattered composure. She forced her tired facial muscles to form a polite, highly practiced smile. It was a thin, fragile, and completely unconvincing smile. It was the exact same smile she used on the friendly postman. It was the smile she used on the concerned, prying neighbors. It was a desperate, invisible shield. She turned around slowly, facing Leo once again. She stood very straight, gripping the edge of the cold metal car door. "Thank you so very much for your kindness, sir," she said softly. Her voice was incredibly polite, perfectly controlled, and entirely empty. "I am perfectly safe now. You have been incredibly helpful. Have a wonderful, safe night." The words hung heavily between them. It was a clear, unmistakable dismissal. It was a desperate, silent plea for him to simply turn around and walk far away. She wanted him to nod politely, accept her empty thanks, and leave her entirely alone in her dark, miserable reality. For a brief, fleeting second, the heavy weight of Leo's old solitary life pulled strongly at him. The old familiar instinct screamed at him to mind his own quiet business. The strict unwritten rules of his lonely existence demanded that he walk away. You do not get involved in other people's messy, dangerous lives. You do not ask difficult, uncomfortable questions. You just keep your head down, fix your engines, and ride your motorcycle. You survive by simply ignoring the pain of the world. He looked deeply into Margaret's pale, terrified eyes. He saw the desperate, silent hope shining brightly there. She was hoping, praying entirely that he would just let it go. She was begging him silently to simply be another blind, uncaring stranger. But his heavy steel-toed boots did not move. He did not turn around. He did not reach for his loud motorcycle keys. Instead, he slowly shifted his massive weight. He crossed his thick, muscular arms casually across his broad chest. The movement looked relaxed, but his entire posture was completely rigid and deeply alert. He looked directly at her thin, fragile wrists, now safely hidden beneath the soft blue wool. Then he raised his dark, intense gaze, meeting her pale, frightened eyes squarely. "Are you all right?" he asked. His deep voice rolled softly through the freezing night air. It was a low, completely controlled, and incredibly steady sound. It was the absolute exact tone of a man who was not making a polite, casual inquiry. He was not asking about the cold weather or the difficult drive home. He was asking a deep, heavy, and undeniable question. It was a firm, unwavering tone that completely refused to be ignored. It did not demand an immediate loud answer, but it firmly, absolutely cut off all of her practiced, easy escapes. Margaret's thin, polite smile faltered instantly. It slipped away quickly, for just a tiny, imperceptible fraction of a second, before she desperately, forcefully pulled it right back into place. Her invisible armor snapped sharply back around her. "Oh yes, of course. I am perfectly fine," she replied much too quickly. The words stumbled out of her mouth in a frantic, nervous rush. "I am just a little bit tired, that is all. It is very late. The cold wind just startled me slightly. But I am absolutely fine. Truly. It was a very smooth, practiced lie. It was entirely too smooth. It was the highly rehearsed script of a woman who had spent years carefully explaining away her own personal tragedies. Leo exhaled slowly, a heavy visible cloud of white breath escaping his mouth into the freezing air. He did not blink. He did not smile. He simply stared at her, his dark eyes piercing straight through her desperate, fragile facade. He let the heavy, uncomfortable silence stretch out between them. He let the howling wind fill the vast, empty space. He wanted her to clearly hear the complete emptiness of her own tragic words. He wanted her to feel the heavy, undeniable weight of his complete disbelief. He uncrossed his heavy arms, letting them drop slowly to his sides. He took one small, highly deliberate step toward her. He did not move aggressively. He did not crowd her small, fragile space. He simply closed the distance just enough to make his massive, unyielding presence entirely known. He looked down briefly at her pale blue sleeve, and then looked directly back into her tired, terrified eyes. "Those marks," Leo said quietly, his deep voice carrying a heavy absolute certainty. "They did not come from simply being tired." The honest, brutal words hung heavily in the freezing desert air. They were completely undeniable. They stripped away the lies, the excuses, and the polite, practiced smiles. They laid the dark, ugly truth completely bare, right under the buzzing yellow light of the empty parking lot. The heavy, undeniable words hung motionless in the freezing air. They hit Margaret exactly like a sudden physical blow. She stopped breathing entirely. Her frail, trembling body completely froze. The loud, howling wind seemed to instantly vanish. The distant electric buzz of the flickering streetlights faded completely away. For one long, agonizing second, the entire universe shrank down to this one dark parking lot. It was just her, the imposing biker, and the terrible, ugly truth standing right between them. Margaret gripped the edge of her cold metal car door. She gripped it so hard, her thin knuckles turned completely white. She desperately needed something to physically hold on to. She felt like the solid asphalt ground beneath her was suddenly cracking wide open. Panic, sharp and incredibly suffocating, rushed fiercely through her veins. Her mind immediately raced back to her dark, quiet house. She thought about Thomas. She thought about his unpredictable, explosive rage. She thought about the heavy, terrifying sound of his boots stomping angrily across the wooden floorboards. A deep, sick feeling of dread settled heavily in her stomach. If Thomas ever found out that she had spoken to a stranger, his anger would be entirely unimaginable. Her heart pounded violently against her ribs. She was entirely terrified of the large, quiet man standing before her. But she was infinitely more terrified of the terrible secret he had just uncovered. For years, she had carefully, meticulously built a massive fortress of lies around her painful life. She had blamed her dark, ugly bruises on loose porch steps. She had blamed her sudden limps on slipping in the wet garden. She had smiled brightly at the curious, prying grocery store clerks. She had politely assured her concerned neighbors that she was just growing old and terribly clumsy. She had repeated these desperate, empty lies so many times, she almost started to believe them herself. It was the only way she could possibly survive. It was the only way a mother could bear the heartbreaking reality that her own child was actively destroying her. She squeezed her pale eyes shut, just for a brief, desperate moment. She tried fiercely to push the rising tears back down. She could not fall apart now. She was completely exposed, standing in a dark, empty parking lot with a man she absolutely did not know. She took a quick, shallow breath, desperately trying to rebuild her shattered, invisible armor. She slowly opened her eyes, but she firmly refused to look at Leo. She stared entirely past him, looking out into the vast, absolute darkness of the empty desert highway. She focused intently on a distant, invisible point, desperately gathering her scattered thoughts. "I told you," she whispered softly, her voice shaking violently in the cold air. "I am just a terribly clumsy old woman. I slipped on the wet tile in my kitchen. I grabbed the heavy wooden doorframe to stop my fall. That is all. I am just incredibly clumsy." She pulled her thick coat even tighter around her small shoulders. She waited nervously for him to simply nod. She waited desperately for him to politely accept her carefully rehearsed excuse and walk completely away. Everyone else always accepted the lie. The doctors, the neighbors, the polite acquaintances. They all nodded, smiled uncomfortably, and quickly looked the other way. It was always easier for people to simply pretend that everything was perfectly fine. But Leo Vance was absolutely not everyone else. He stood perfectly still, his heavy boots planted firmly on the cold gravel. He did not blink. He did not look away. He listened to her frail, trembling voice, and his dark heart ached with a profound, familiar sorrow. He had heard that exact same desperate script before. It was a different time, a different place, and a completely different voice. But the painful, highly rehearsed words were exactly the same. He remembered his sister Maya looking down at her battered hands, swearing softly that she had simply tripped over a loose rug. He remembered the intense, burning shame in her tearful eyes. He remembered his own cowardly silence as he had politely accepted her obvious lie. He slowly shifted his massive weight. He took one small, deliberate step closer. He did not move quickly. He did not want to frighten her any more than she already was. He just wanted to make absolutely sure that she could clearly hear every single word he said. "I have known clumsy," Leo said, his deep voice rolling quietly through the freezing night. "I've seen what a bad fall looks like. I have seen what bumping into a doorframe does." He paused, letting the heavy, honest truth settle between them. He looked directly into her wide, terrified eyes. "That," he said softly, pointing a thick, calloused finger slightly toward her hidden wrist, "is absolutely not clumsy." The heavy silence stretched out again. It was much longer this time. It was incredibly thick and deeply suffocating. Margaret swallowed hard, her throat feeling like dry sandpaper. A large, loud cargo truck suddenly roared past the diner on the distant highway. Its massive, bright yellow headlights swept quickly and aggressively across the dark parking lot. The sudden, intense beam of light hit Margaret directly in the face. She flinched violently. It was a small, quick, and entirely instinctive reaction. She instantly raised her trembling hands, pulling her shoulders up tight defensively, guarding her frail face. It was the tragic, undeniable reflex of a person who constantly expected to be suddenly struck. Leo caught the violent flinch immediately. He watched her desperate, fearful reaction, and he quietly filed it away in his sharp, observant mind. It was just another sad, heartbreaking piece of her terrible puzzle. When the bright light finally faded, plunging them back into the deep shadows, Margaret let out a slow, shaky breath. It sounded exactly like a quiet, defeated sob. She slowly lowered her hands, realizing sadly that she had just betrayed her own dark secret all over again. "You really do not have to worry about me," she said softly, her voice breaking painfully on the freezing air. It was no longer a polite, practiced dismissal. It was a quiet, desperate plea. "Please, sir, really, just let it go." Leo tilted his head slightly, his dark eyes studying her carefully. He saw the complete exhaustion etched deeply into her lined face. He saw the heavy, invisible burden crushing her small shoulders. "Then why?" Leo asked, his voice incredibly gentle, but completely unwavering. "Did you ask me to walk you out?" The simple, direct question landed incredibly hard. He saw the heavy words physically hit her. Her pale lips parted slightly, but absolutely no sound came out. She searched frantically for a safe, polite answer. But there was absolutely no simple answer to that profound question. And they both knew it. She had not asked the young, friendly waitress for help. She had not asked the nice, elderly couple who had left the diner just an hour before. She had specifically chosen the most intimidating, dangerous-looking man in the entire room. She had chosen the heavy leather, the dark beard, and the cold, unreadable eyes. She had chosen a man who looked entirely capable of terrible violence. Finally, she looked up, meeting his intense gaze completely. This time, there was absolutely no polite fake smile. There was no practiced, easy excuse. There was only a deep, raw, and completely unfiltered pain shining brightly behind her watery eyes. "It is just very late," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the howling wind. "And you look exactly like someone who would absolutely not let anything bad happen." Leo let out a quiet, slow breath. It sounded almost like a dark, humorless chuckle. "That is funny," he said softly, looking away for a brief, fleeting second. "Because most people usually think I am the bad thing that happens." That honest, unexpected confession earned the faintest, smallest flicker of a real smile from Margaret. It was a sad, highly fragile smile, but it was absolutely genuine. It did not last long. Her pale gaze dropped immediately back to the cracked asphalt. Her thin right hand moved completely unconsciously across her body. Her frail fingers began gently and nervously brushing over the soft blue wool that completely hid her dark bruises. She was desperately trying to soothe herself. Leo followed the sad, anxious motion with his eyes. He watched her frail fingers tremble. He felt a deep, powerful surge of protective anger rise hot in his chest. He took a slow, deep breath, firmly pushing his own dark emotions down. He needed to be perfectly steady for her. He looked back up, focusing entirely on her pale, tired face. "Who did it?" he asked. There was absolutely no anger in his deep voice. There was no loud judgment or harsh accusation. There was only a quiet, absolute certainty. He already knew it was someone very close to her. It was always someone close. Margaret closed her eyes tightly. It was a brief, heartbreaking moment. She looked exactly like a woman who was actively weighing an incredibly heavy, impossible choice. She had protected her abuser for so many long, agonizing years. She had completely sacrificed her own safety, her own peace, and her own happiness just to keep his terrible secret safe. When she finally opened her pale eyes again, she looked incredibly old. She looked deeply, profoundly tired, in a way that went far beyond a single sleepless night. The heavy, invisible dam inside her finally broke entirely. A single hot tear slipped quietly down her wrinkled cheek. "My son," she whispered. The two words, "my son," hung heavily in the freezing desert air. They felt entirely wrong. They were a terrible, ugly contradiction, clashing violently against the quiet, peaceful image of the elderly woman standing there. A son is supposed to protect his mother. A son is supposed to be a source of pride and comfort in a mother's old age. The absolute reality that the dark, angry bruises on her fragile wrists were put there by the very child she had raised felt like a deep, sickening blow. Leo did not react outwardly. His large, rugged face remained perfectly stoic and unreadable. But deep inside his broad chest, a cold, hard knot pulled completely tight. Before Leo could even process the heavy weight of her tragic confession, Margaret started speaking again. She spoke incredibly quickly, her frail voice rushing and stumbling over the words. She was desperately trying to explain it. She was trying to soften the terrible blow, and make the ugly truth somehow make logical sense. He gets so incredibly frustrated sometimes," she continued, her pale hands waving nervously in the cold air. "Thomas is under a terrible amount of stress right now. He really is a good boy deep down. He just had some very bad luck with his businesses. They all failed one after another. And the bills, they just keep piling up on the kitchen counter. The phone rings constantly with angry debt collectors. It is absolutely overwhelming for him. It is just not easy for him right now." Leo stared at her, a profound, heavy disbelief flickering quietly behind his dark, steady eyes. He stood perfectly still, letting the freezing wind pull at his heavy leather jacket. He listened to her frantic, desperate excuses, and his heart broke just a little bit more. "So," Leo said slowly, his deep voice cutting cleanly through her nervous rambling, "because his business has failed, he takes his anger out on you." Margaret shook her head immediately. It was a fast, highly defensive reflex. No, it is absolutely not like that," she insisted, her voice trembling violently. "He does not mean to hurt me. He really does not. He just loses his temper very quickly. The pressure just builds up inside him until he completely explodes. And I really should know better. I should not push him when he is having a bad day. I ask too many questions. I get in his way. It is partly my fault for making him so upset." The Leo ran a large grease-stained hand slowly over his thick, graying beard. He looked away for a brief, painful second, staring out into the vast, absolute darkness of the empty highway. He needed a moment to completely process the heartbreaking tragedy of her twisted logic. He had heard these exact, desperate excuses many times before. He had heard broken, terrified people fiercely defend the very monsters who actively hurt them. He knew how easily a victim could be manipulated into carrying the heavy burden of someone else's guilt. It was like a second nature, a desperate survival mechanism built entirely on fear. His sister Maya had used those exact same words. She had blamed her own cooking for her broken nose. She had blamed her own loud voice for the dark bruises on her ribs. But hearing those terrible self-blaming words coming from Margaret, it hit him completely differently. She was a gentle, retired librarian. She was a woman who should have been spending her final years reading quiet books in a warm, sunny room. She was the absolute last person in the world who should be standing in a freezing parking lot justifying physical abuse. Leo turned his intense, dark gaze back to her pale, exhausted face. "You live with him right now?" he asked, his voice low and incredibly steady. Margaret nodded slowly, her pale eyes dropping back down to the cracked asphalt. "Yes," she whispered softly. "After my beloved husband Arthur passed away 5 years ago, everything completely fell apart. The medical bills were simply astronomical. The bank took our old house. I had absolutely nowhere left to go. Thomas said I should not be living entirely alone. He said it just made sense for me to move into his spare bedroom. I thought he was trying to take care of me." She swallowed hard, her thin fingers nervously tracing the edge of her heavy leather purse. Inside that purse, the hidden unused bus ticket suddenly felt 1,000,000 miles away. It felt exactly like a foolish, childish dream. She was trapped. She was entirely dependent on the very man who was actively destroying her. She had given him her last bit of savings to help with his massive debts. She had completely surrendered her independence for a false, terrifying sense of security. Leo let out a long, slow breath. The white cloud of condensation drifted lazily into the dark night. He looked past her, glancing toward the empty, quiet road, and then he looked directly back into her wide, terrified eyes. "And do you?" Leo asked, his voice dropping to a near absolute whisper. "Do you actually feel safe in that house?" The simple, profound question landed infinitely heavier than anything else he had said tonight. It was a massive, undeniable weight dropping directly onto the freezing gravel between them. Margaret froze entirely. She went completely unnaturally still. The loud howling wind seemed to fade into absolute silence. The flickering, buzzing streetlights overhead seemed to dim. Every single defense mechanism she had left completely shut down. Her thin, frail fingers tightened violently around the strap of her heavy purse. She squeezed the thick leather so hard it creaked loudly in the quiet night. She opened her pale, trembling mouth. She desperately wanted to say yes. She wanted to quickly lie just one more time. She wanted to confidently tell this large, intimidating stranger that her son loved her and that everything was perfectly fine. She wanted to pull her thick coat tight, get into her cold car, and drive entirely away from this painful, overwhelming confrontation. For one long, agonizing moment, Leo genuinely thought she was going to lie. He mentally prepared himself to hear another empty, practiced excuse. But then he watched her small, fragile shoulders sag heavily. It was exactly as if a massive, invisible string holding her entirely together had suddenly snapped. The heavy, crushing exhaustion of her miserable life finally pulled her completely down. She could not carry the terrible, heavy lie for one single second longer. She did not look up at him. She stared blindly down at her sensible, worn shoes. A single hot tear finally escaped, rolling silently down her deeply lined cheek. "Not always," she whispered. It was the quietest, most fragile voice Leo had ever heard. The two simple words were barely a breath against the harsh desert wind. But in the deep, heavy silence of the night, they rang out exactly like a loud, tragic bell. That was it. That was the absolute, undeniable turning point. That was the exact moment everything in the world shifted completely. Margaret had finally said it out loud. She had taken her darkest, most terrifying secret and pulled it entirely out into the light. She had admitted to a complete stranger that her own home was a dangerous, highly volatile prison. Leo nodded once. It was a slow, deliberate, and incredibly solemn nod. He looked exactly like a man who had just solemnly confirmed a terrible, heartbreaking truth that he had already known. His massive, broad shoulders seemed to square off against the freezing wind. The quiet, protective anger inside his chest finally solidified into a cold, unbreakable resolve. He was absolutely not going to walk away tonight. He was not going to make the exact same tragic mistake he had made 10 years ago. "Then," Leo said quietly, his deep voice rumbling with absolute, unwavering certainty, "that is a very big problem." Margaret looked up very quickly. A sudden, sharp hint of pure alarm crossed her pale, wrinkled face. She immediately realized exactly what she had just said. She had spoken the dark, terrible truth out loud. She quickly raised her thin hands, waving them nervously in the cold night air. No, it is absolutely not a problem," she stammered quickly. Her frail voice rose to a frantic high pitch. "I mean, it is just something we are working through. It is absolutely nothing that cannot be handled. I really do not want to cause any trouble. I just need to go home right now." Leo met her terrified gaze. His dark eyes were incredibly steady and completely unyielding. He did not step back. He did not let her easily brush the terrible reality completely aside. "It is already trouble, Margaret," Leo said softly. Before she could desperately argue, another loud sound suddenly pierced the quiet night. A vehicle was approaching fast. In the far distance, a pair of bright, glaring headlights suddenly appeared on the dark highway. The loud, heavy rumble of a large engine grew steadily louder, cutting aggressively through the howling desert wind. The bright lights quickly turned sharply directly into the Starlight Diner parking lot. Margaret gasped loudly. She froze completely, just like a terrified deer caught entirely in headlights. Her frail body went completely and unnaturally rigid. The heavy leather purse almost slipped entirely from her trembling hands. She instinctively and completely unconsciously took a fast, panicked step right toward Leo. She wanted to hide. She desperately needed to completely disappear. If that was Thomas driving that loud truck, her life was entirely over. If Thomas saw her standing in a dark parking lot with a strange, imposing man, his violent rage would be absolutely unstoppable. Leo noticed her sudden, desperate movement immediately. He saw the pure, absolute terror violently overtaking her pale face. He did not hesitate for a single split second. He quickly shifted his massive, heavy frame. He smoothly and quietly placed his broad body directly between her and the approaching bright headlights. He did not make a huge, highly dramatic show of it. He just casually stepped forward, acting exactly like a thick, unbreakable brick wall, firmly shielding her fragile form from the rest of the cold, dangerous world. "Does Thomas know exactly where you are right now?" Leo asked. His deep voice was incredibly low and strictly business. Margaret hesitated, shaking her head quickly. She stayed completely hidden behind his wide, leather-clad shoulders. "No," she whispered, her voice completely breathless. "He expects me to be home very soon. He thinks I am just sleeping in my bedroom." Leo nodded slowly. His thick, graying jaw tightened visibly just a fraction. The muscles in his neck strained slightly. "Yes," he said quietly. His eyes locked entirely on the approaching vehicle. "I figured as much." The large, dark pickup truck drove slowly across the cracked asphalt. It finally parked several rows away from their quiet, hidden spot. The heavy engine died with a loud metallic clunk. A tall, completely unfamiliar man quickly stepped out of the driver's seat. He slammed the heavy metal door, pulled his jacket tight, and walked rapidly straight toward the brightly lit diner. He did not look their way even once. He paid absolutely no attention to the two quiet figures standing entirely in the dark shadows. Margaret stayed perfectly hidden behind Leo. She held her breath tightly until the diner door finally opened and quickly swallowed the stranger inside. Only then did she finally let out a long, shaky, and deeply relieved breath. Her thin shoulders dropped heavily with absolute exhaustion. Leo slowly turned his head. He looked deeply down at her. He observed her for a very long, quiet moment. He was truly seeing her now. He was not just looking at a polite, elderly woman who had simply asked for an escort to her car. He was looking directly at a desperate, trapped prisoner who had been carrying a crushing, impossible weight for entirely too long. "You do not have to go back there tonight," Leo said. The heavy words came out of his mouth incredibly simply, but they carried a massive, undeniable weight. They hit the freezing air exactly like a solid, heavy stone. Margaret blinked rapidly. She was completely caught off guard. She stared up at him, her pale eyes wide with deep confusion. I have to," she stammered blindly. "It is my home, sir. All of my things are there." "No," Leo said gently, but incredibly firmly. "It is his house, and you just told me you are not safe there." Margaret violently shook her head again. A fresh wave of absolute panic started to slowly creep back into her tired expression. "I cannot just leave," she argued desperately. "I have absolutely no money. I have absolutely nowhere else to go. I would have to sleep in my freezing car." She thought briefly about the hidden one-way bus ticket tucked safely inside her purse. But the bus station was miles away. Thomas would easily track her down long before the morning bus ever arrived. The absolute fear of his violent anger paralyzed her completely. Leo did not answer her frantic questions right away. He slowly reached his large, rough hand deep into the inner pocket of his heavy leather jacket. He pulled out a small, thick, dark gray cell phone. It was an older, rugged model. He kept his dark, intense eyes locked firmly on hers. "I know some people," Leo said softly. "They are very good, highly trusted people. You would be perfectly safe with them. Nobody, absolutely nobody, is going to lay a single violent hand on you there." Margaret simply stared at him. A fierce, confusing battle was actively raging inside her pale, exhausted face. Deep, absolute uncertainty fought violently with a tiny, desperate spark of hope. "Why would you do that for me?" she asked. Her voice cracked painfully in the freezing wind. "You do not even know my name." Leo paused completely. He quietly considered her profound, heartbroken question. Then he gave a very small, incredibly sad shrug of his massive shoulders. "Because," Leo said, simply pointing his chin slightly toward her hidden arm, "I saw your wrist." The heavy, complete silence settled deeply between them once again. But this time, it absolutely did not feel empty. It did not feel like a cold, awkward void. It felt exactly like a massive, heavy door slowly unlocking. It felt like a solid, undeniable decision just waiting quietly to be fully made. Margaret stood perfectly still. She had spent countless agonizing years learning exactly how to endure terrible pain. She had learned how to carefully explain things away to concerned doctors. She had learned how to magically make dark bruises sound exactly like clumsy, innocent accidents. She had learned how to make absolute crushing fear feel like something much smaller than it truly was. But standing exactly there, in that dim, freezing parking lot, everything suddenly changed. Leo was actively watching her. He was absolutely not looking at her with pathetic, useless pity. He was looking at her with complete, absolute certainty. And in that powerful, quiet gaze, Margaret finally realized something profound. It was something she had absolutely not let herself admit in a very long time. She absolutely, positively did not want to go back to that house. The radical, dangerous thought came to her mind very quietly. It felt almost like a soft, terrifying whisper that she tried desperately to quickly ignore. But the thought simply did not leave. It firmly stayed right there. It pressed aggressively against all the strict rules she thought she was supposed to follow. "I cannot just completely disappear," Margaret said finally. Her thin voice was incredibly fragile, but she was desperately trying to sound very firm. "Thomas will worry. He will become incredibly angry. He will tear the whole town completely apart looking for me." Leo tilted his large, rugged head just slightly. His dark, heavily bearded face remained completely unreadable, but his deep voice was as steady as a solid rock. "He is already angry, Margaret," Leo said simply. That simple truth landed infinitely harder than anything else he had said tonight, because it was completely, undeniably true. Thomas's violent anger was absolutely not about her. It was not about what she did or what she failed to do. It never had been. It was simply his own dark, twisted poison spilling out all over her. Margaret slowly looked down at her own trembling hands. She saw the faint, uncontrollable shaking that she absolutely could not stop. For one brief, profound moment, she actually saw herself exactly the way Leo probably did. She did not see a clumsy, forgetful, or burdensome old woman. She clearly saw someone who had been slowly, painfully shrinking herself just to fit neatly into a terrible life that constantly hurt her. "I just do not want to make things worse," she whispered softly. Her pale eyes filled entirely with fresh tears. Leo took a slow, deep breath of the freezing desert air. He took one small, highly deliberate step much closer to her. He was absolutely careful not to crowd her space or overwhelm her frail senses. He just wanted to deeply ground the important moment. "Sometimes, Margaret," Leo said softly, "simply walking completely away is the absolute only thing that ever makes it better. Not for him, but for you." The honest words hung beautifully in the freezing air. They were incredibly simple, but they carried a massive, undeniable weight. Margaret actually felt something completely foreign shift deep inside her soul. It was a feeling she had absolutely not felt in many, many agonizing years. It was a choice. It was absolutely not a heavy, crushing obligation. It was not pure, blind survival. It was not complete, absolute fear. It was a clear, entirely open choice. In the far distance, a lonely stray dog barked loudly. The low, steady hum of distant, heavy traffic simply carried on. The whole world acted like absolutely nothing had changed. But right there, standing by the rusted blue sedan, everything had changed entirely. Margaret slowly turned her head. She glanced carefully at her old, reliable car. She looked at the highly familiar shape that would dutifully take her directly back to the exact same house. It would take her back to the exact same crushing tension. It would take her back to constantly walking on eggshells around someone else's violent, unpredictable temper. Then she slowly turned her tired head directly back to Leo. "If I decide to actually go with you," she said slowly. Her frail voice was finally gaining just a tiny bit of strength. "I really do not know what exactly happens next. I do not have a plan." Leo gave her a very small, highly reassuring nod. "You absolutely do not have to have a plan," Leo said gently. "We just need to figure out tonight. Just this one single night." There was absolutely no pressure in his deep voice. There was absolutely no frantic urgency. There was simply a clear, entirely open path, waiting quietly in the freezing dark. Margaret hesitated one final, highly agonizing time. Countless years of deep ingrained habit pulled her strongly backward. A dark, terrifying voice in her head told her to simply keep things exactly the way they were. It told her to just quietly endure the terrible pain for just a little bit longer. But then she clearly remembered the terrifying way she had violently flinched at the approaching headlights. She clearly remembered how her own quiet home absolutely no longer felt like a place where she could actually breathe. She took a slow, deep breath and finally exhaled softly. "Okay," Margaret said. It was just one single simple word. But this time it absolutely did not come from a place of fear. It came from a deep, powerful place of pure decision. Leo nodded exactly once. He looked like a man who had just secured a highly valuable treasure. That single word was absolutely all he needed to hear. He took a very small, respectful step back, carefully giving her plenty of breathing space. "Lock your car doors tightly," Leo instructed quietly. "Leave it right here. We will absolutely come back for it later." Margaret quickly did exactly as he said. She reached out with her trembling fingers. She firmly pushed the heavy metal lock down tight. She slammed the heavy rusted door completely shut. When she finally turned around directly facing him again, there was a completely different posture about her. She was absolutely not standing entirely tall, with supreme confidence. But she was definitely standing just a little bit straighter. Leo raised his dark old cell phone right up to his ear. He pressed a few quick buttons. He waited quietly for the line to connect. He turned slightly away respectfully, giving her a tiny bit of privacy. He spoke very softly into the heavy plastic receiver. He spoke in very highly controlled tones. He quickly gave an address. He quietly said a name. He provided exactly enough information for the trusted person on the other end to completely understand the urgent situation. When he finally hung up the phone, he turned back around. He gestured politely with his large hand toward his massive black motorcycle. It was parked quietly near the dark edge of the empty lot. "Have you ever actually been on one of those?" Leo asked, his voice softening entirely. Margaret blinked rapidly, genuinely surprised by the strange question. Then, completely unexpectedly, she let out a very small, highly nervous but genuine laugh. "Not in about 50 long years," she admitted honestly. Leo smiled softly. It was a very faint, highly guarded hint of a smile, but it absolutely broke through his tough, rugged exterior for the very first time. "Well," Leo said quietly, "I strongly guess it is definitely time for a very quick reminder." He carefully reached out, grabbing a heavy black spare helmet. He gently and very respectfully handed it over to her. He did not rush her at all. He quietly helped her safely adjust the tight strap, completely avoiding any sudden alarming movements. A few short minutes later, the massive heavy engine roared violently to life. It was a deep, powerful, and incredibly steady sound. Margaret awkwardly climbed up, carefully settling onto the thick leather seat. She tentatively wrapped her thin, fragile arms around his thick leather jacket. As the heavy motorcycle slowly pulled completely out of the dark diner parking lot, Margaret suddenly realized something profound. It was a beautiful feeling she had completely forgotten. She actually felt safe. She knew the terrible, ugly world was still out there. She knew absolutely everything could still go completely wrong. But for the very first time in countless agonizing years, she absolutely knew she was no longer facing the terrible dark, entirely alone. The loud motorcycle quickly accelerated, completely disappearing into the freezing desert night. The heavy black motorcycle completely tore through the freezing desert night. The massive, powerful engine roared loudly and aggressively. The deep, vibrating sound echoed fiercely across the vast, empty stretches of the dark Arizona highway. Margaret kept her pale, tired eyes tightly closed for the very first few miles. She pressed her cold, fragile face directly against the thick, tough leather of Leo's broad back. She gripped the heavy material with all of her remaining desperate strength. Her thin, trembling fingers dug deeply into the thick fabric. She was absolutely terrified of falling off, but surprisingly, she was not terrified of the man driving the loud machine. The freezing desert wind whipped violently around them. It pulled aggressively at the edges of her thick wool coat. But Leo's massive, imposing frame took the absolute brunt of the harsh weather. He acted exactly like a large, solid shield, completely protecting her frail body from the bitter, biting cold. For a very long, intense time, neither of them spoke a single word. The incredibly loud, deafening roar of the motorcycle engine made talking entirely impossible. But Margaret absolutely did not want to talk. She just wanted to feel the powerful forward motion. She wanted to feel the absolute, undeniable distance growing rapidly between herself and her dark, miserable life. She slowly opened her pale eyes just a tiny fraction. She looked out past Leo's wide shoulders. The long yellow lines of the dark highway blurred entirely together. They flashed by in a continuous, glowing streak. The dark, jagged silhouettes of the distant desert mountains stood tall against the pitch-black sky. The entire world was rushing past her incredibly fast. It felt exactly like a sudden wild dream. Just 20 short minutes ago, she was standing in a brightly lit diner, completely paralyzed by her own fear. Now she was flying blindly into the dark unknown, holding tightly onto a complete stranger. She squeezed her heavy leather purse tightly between her body and Leo's back. She could clearly feel the solid rectangular shape of the old leather-bound book inside it. She thought deeply about the hidden one-way bus ticket tucked safely between the yellowed pages. She had carried that secret ticket for 6 long, agonizing months. It was her only desperate sliver of hope. It was a silent, unfulfilled promise that she would eventually escape. But right now, feeling the intense, vibrating power of the heavy motorcycle, she realized something truly profound. She absolutely did not need that secret ticket tonight. She had finally found a completely different way out. The heavy, invisible chains that had bound her to Thomas and his violent temper were completely broken. She was actually leaving. The sudden, shocking realization hit her exactly like a physical wave. She let out a loud, shaky breath that was completely lost in the rushing wind. Leo kept his dark, intense eyes locked firmly on the empty road ahead. His large, heavily calloused hands gripped the metal handlebars with absolute, unwavering control. He navigated the sharp, dark curves of the desert highway with complete, effortless precision. He was a man who knew these lonely roads exactly like the back of his own hand. But his mind was completely far away. He was not just driving a terrified elderly woman to a safe house. He was actively driving far away from his own haunting past. He felt the light, fragile weight of Margaret's small hands gripping his heavy jacket. Every single time she squeezed tighter, he felt a deep, heavy stone lift entirely out of his chest. He thought deeply about his late sister Maya. He remembered the tragic, desperate way she used to look at him begging silently for help that he never gave. He remembered the heavy, crushing guilt that had suffocated him for 10 long years. He had failed completely to save the one person who truly mattered to him. But tonight, the heavy, dark ghost of his failure was finally quiet. The loud, roaring engine drowned out the terrible, lingering memories. He was finally doing exactly what he should have done a decade ago. He was taking someone far away from the dark monsters. He was completely keeping his old, broken promise, even if it was to a complete stranger. The thought brought a fierce, burning heat to his cold eyes. He blinked hard, pushing the sudden emotion completely away. He focused entirely on the bright white beam of his motorcycle headlight, cutting sharply through the absolute darkness. After riding continuously for almost 20 miles, the dense, dark desert began to slowly change. The long, flat stretches of sand gave way to large, rocky hills. Leo began to slowly and very carefully reduce their speed. The loud, roaring engine shifted down to a low, steady rumble. He smoothly pulled the heavy motorcycle off the main paved highway. He turned sharply onto a narrow, highly uneven dirt road. The sudden, jarring transition from smooth asphalt to rough gravel shook the entire bike. Margaret gasped softly, her grip tightening violently around his wide waist. Leo immediately brought the heavy motorcycle to a complete, gentle stop. He kept the powerful engine running, but he firmly planted his heavy steel-toed boots solidly on the rocky ground, fully stabilizing the heavy machine. He turned his large head slightly over his left shoulder. "Are you doing okay back there, Margaret?" Leo asked. His deep voice was incredibly loud and very clear over the low rumble of the idling engine. Margaret took a deep, shaky breath of the freezing, dusty air. She slowly loosened her tight, frantic grip on his heavy jacket. She pushed the dark visor of her heavy helmet up just a few inches. "I am perfectly fine," Margaret said loudly, her frail voice carrying a new, surprising strength. "It is just incredibly cold, but I am okay. Truly." Leo nodded slowly, his dark eyes searching her pale, shadowed face. He saw the deep, complete exhaustion there, but he also saw something else entirely. The pure, absolute terror that had completely paralyzed her in the diner parking lot was heavily fading. It was slowly being replaced by a quiet, determined resilience. "We are almost there," Leo promised quietly, his deep voice offering complete, absolute reassurance. "It is just a couple of miles down this rough road. It is going to be a little bit bumpy. Just hold on tight to me." Margaret nodded firmly. She reached up and firmly pulled the dark visor completely back down. "I am holding on, Leo," she said simply. Leo smiled softly beneath his thick, graying beard. He slowly released the heavy clutch and gently rolled the throttle. The massive motorcycle lurched forward slowly, carefully navigating the deep ruts and sharp rocks of the dark dirt road. They rode deeper and deeper into the absolute wilderness. The tall, jagged shadows of the rocky hills completely surrounded them. The loud, buzzing streetlights of the distant town were now completely gone. They were entirely submerged in the vast, quiet embrace of the dark desert. As they slowly approached the very end of the hidden road, a soft, warm glow suddenly appeared in the thick darkness. It was a single bright yellow porch light, completely cutting through the freezing night. It shone brightly, exactly like a small, reliable beacon in a massive, dark ocean. Leo guided the heavy bike straight toward that welcoming light. The large, shadowy outline of a wide, sprawling ranch house slowly came into view. It was deeply secluded, entirely hidden from the main road by tall, thick trees and a heavy wooden fence. It was the absolute perfect place to completely disappear. He smoothly pulled the heavy motorcycle directly into the wide dirt driveway. The loose gravel crunched loudly beneath the thick tires. He finally killed the loud engine. The sudden absolute silence that immediately followed was incredibly heavy and deeply profound. The howling desert wind was completely blocked here by the tall, protective trees. Leo quickly kicked the heavy metal stand down. He stood up slowly, stretching his stiff, massive shoulders. He turned around entirely and gently offered his large, rough hand to Margaret. She looked at his large hand for one brief second. Then she reached out and firmly placed her thin, fragile fingers directly into his solid grasp. He carefully and very respectfully helped her climb down from the high leather seat. Her old, tired legs wobbled slightly as her sensible shoes finally hit the solid, stable ground. She leaned heavily against his thick arm, just for a moment completely exhausted by the intense emotional journey. "We made it," Leo said softly, his deep voice breaking the complete peaceful silence. Margaret slowly took the heavy black helmet off. She handed it quietly back to him. Her white hair was completely flattened and wildly messy. Her pale face was flushed red from the freezing wind. But as she looked up at the warm, glowing light of the safe house, a beautiful, genuine smile finally broke across her deeply lined face. "Yes," Margaret whispered softly, a profound, heavy weight finally lifting from her soul. "We absolutely did." The crunch of the heavy motorcycle tires on the loose gravel had already announced their quiet arrival. They did not even have to walk up the wooden steps or loudly knock on the heavy door. Before Leo could even reach out, the thick, solid oak door swung completely open. A flood of incredibly warm, soft, yellow light immediately spilled out right onto the dark wooden porch. It chased the freezing dark shadows completely away. Standing right there in the open doorway was Elena Rodriguez. She was a slightly shorter, strongly built woman. She wore comfortable faded blue jeans and a thick, highly oversized knitted sweater. Her long dark hair was heavily streaked with silver. It was tied loosely at the back of her neck. Elena was a former highly experienced social worker. She had spent countless grueling years navigating the absolute darkest, most broken corners of the foster care system. She had seen terrible things. She had heard completely heartbreaking stories. Because of that heavy past, she had eventually bought this large, isolated ranch. She had quietly and very secretly turned it into a completely safe, hidden haven for people exactly like Margaret. Elena stood perfectly still on the warm porch. She did not look surprised to see a massive biker at 2 a.m. She absolutely did not look annoyed by the sudden late-night intrusion. Instead, she completely radiated a deep, profound sense of calm. She had incredibly kind, highly perceptive brown eyes. It was exactly the kind of look of a woman who already understood absolutely everything without ever needing to ask a single difficult question. "Leo," Elena said softly. Her voice was incredibly warm, rich, and deeply welcoming. It completely cut through the freezing, bitter cold. I heard the loud engine coming down the long dirt road. I already put the heavy kettle right on the hot stove. Leo stepped slowly forward, leading Margaret very gently by her thin arm. He stopped right at the bottom of the wooden porch steps. He looked up at his old trusted friend. "Elena," Leo said quietly, his deep voice carrying a massive, heavy exhaustion. "This is Margaret. She desperately needs a very safe, quiet place to stay tonight. She absolutely cannot go back to her own house." Elena immediately shifted her warm gaze directly to the frail, trembling elderly woman. She did not intensely stare. She did not completely look her up and down, making any harsh judgments. She simply smiled, a very gentle, highly reassuring smile. She slowly walked down the 3 wooden steps. She moved very carefully, making absolutely sure not to startle the terrified woman. When Elena finally reached them, she gently reached out with her warm, soft hands. She completely ignored the heavy, imposing biker standing there. She focused entirely on Margaret. She very lightly and respectfully placed her hands right over Margaret's trembling, freezing fingers. "Hello, Margaret," Elena said, her voice dropping to a soft, incredibly soothing whisper. "My name is Elena. You are entirely safe here. Nobody, absolutely, nobody is going to find you on this ranch. You do not have to be afraid anymore." Margaret looked deeply into Elena's kind eyes. The freezing wind whipped a stray strand of white hair right across her pale face. She felt the incredible, absolute warmth radiating completely from Elena's soft hands. It was a completely foreign, highly shocking sensation. For the very first time in countless agonizing years, she was being touched with pure, gentle kindness rather than violent, unpredictable anger. Her pale, thin lips trembled violently. She desperately tried to form a polite, coherent sentence. She wanted to thank her. She wanted to quickly apologize for being a terrible, annoying burden so late at night. But the heavy, completely overwhelming relief completely blocked her dry throat. Margaret started, her frail voice completely cracking. "I do not want to be a terrible bother. I am so sorry for waking you up. Hush now," Elena interrupted gently, squeezing her freezing hands just a tiny bit tighter. "You are absolutely not a bother, Margaret. You are a highly welcome guest. And you absolutely never and ever have to apologize for completely saving your own life. Do you understand me?" The highly profound, incredibly honest words hit Margaret completely hard. Saving her own life. That was exactly what she had just done. She had left the dark, terrible house. She had left the angry, violent son. She had chosen to finally live. Margaret nodded slowly, a single hot tear finally breaking free. It rolled rapidly down her freezing, wrinkled cheek. "Yes," she whispered softly. "I understand." "Good," Elena smiled brightly. "Now, let us get you completely out of this freezing wind. It is entirely too cold for you to be standing out here in the dark. Come inside, Margaret. The house is very warm." Elena gently wrapped her strong arm completely around Margaret's small, fragile shoulders. She carefully and very slowly guided her up the wooden steps. Margaret moved stiffly, her old joints aching sharply from the freezing motorcycle ride. But she did not resist at all. She allowed herself to be completely led toward the bright, warm light. As they reached the wide-open doorway, Margaret suddenly stopped completely. She turned her head, looking quickly back over her small shoulder. Leo was still standing there firmly at the bottom of the wooden steps. His massive dark silhouette completely blended into the pitch-black night. He had not moved a single inch. He stood perfectly still, his heavy hands resting casually in his thick leather pockets. He was quietly watching her, making absolutely sure she completely crossed the safe threshold. "Are you absolutely not coming inside?" Margaret asked. Her frail voice suddenly held a tiny, sharp edge of panic. The deep, terrifying thought of this giant protective stranger leaving her completely alone was highly unsettling. Leo shook his large, rugged head very slowly. He offered her that exact same small, highly guarded smile. "No, Margaret," Leo said softly, his deep voice carrying through the quiet desert night. "My absolute job is completely done here. I belong entirely back out there on the dark road. You belong right here in the warm light." Margaret clutched her heavy leather purse tightly against her chest. She strongly felt the thick, rectangular shape of the hidden book. She felt the massive, heavy weight of the secret unused bus ticket. She had actively planned to simply run completely away, completely alone, into the terrifying unknown. But Leo had completely changed her entire tragic path. He had actively driven her to a real safe home. "I do not even know how to possibly repay you," Margaret said. Her voice was incredibly thick, heavily choked with deep, profound emotion. "You completely saved me tonight. You are a truly good man, Leo." Leo looked down quickly, actively avoiding her intense, grateful gaze. A harsh, painful memory of his sister Maya flashed violently through his tired mind. He absolutely did not feel like a good man. He felt exactly like a deeply broken man who was finally paying back a massive, impossible debt. "You absolutely do not owe me a single thing, Margaret," Leo said quietly, looking directly back up into her eyes. "Just completely promise me one thing. Promise me that you will absolutely never ever go back to that dark house. Do not ever let him put his angry hands on you again." Margaret stood perfectly straight right there on the warm porch. She looked directly into his dark, tired eyes. The deep, absolute terror was finally gone, completely. "I promise you," Margaret said firmly. "I am absolutely never going back." Leo nodded exactly once, completely satisfied with her strong answer. He slowly turned his massive, heavy frame entirely around. He walked heavily back toward his large black motorcycle. Elena stood quietly exactly by the open door. She looked completely out at the large, imposing biker. "Thank you, Leo," Elena called out softly. "Ride incredibly safe out there in the dark." "Always do, Elena," Leo replied completely without looking back. He quickly swung his heavy steel-toed boot completely over the leather seat. He forcefully kicked the metal stand up. He firmly turned the key, and the massive engine roared violently back to life. The loud, aggressive sound completely shattered the quiet night one final time. He slowly rolled the heavy throttle and drove completely away, disappearing entirely into the pitch-black desert. Margaret watched the small red taillight completely fade into the dark distance. She took one final, incredibly deep breath of the freezing desert air. Then she completely turned around and finally stepped over the warm wooden threshold, completely entering the bright safe house. Elena gently closed the heavy solid oak door right behind her. The loud, completely firm click of the metal lock sounded exactly like the beautiful absolute end of a very long, terrible nightmare. The heavy solid oak door clicked firmly shut. It sealed the freezing desert wind entirely outside. Margaret stood perfectly still in the bright, warm hallway. She felt completely and entirely disoriented. The sudden dramatic shift from the freezing dark parking lot to the cozy, fragrant home, was completely overwhelming. The air inside the house smelled incredibly sweet. It smelled like warm cinnamon, fresh pine, and old books. It was a smell that instantly reminded her of a much happier time. It reminded her of the days long before her husband passed away. Elena gently reached out, taking Margaret's thick, wet coat. She hung it carefully on a wooden peg right by the door. She moved with a slow, highly deliberate grace. She did not rush Margaret at all. She understood perfectly that trauma takes time to physically process. "The kitchen is right this way, Margaret," Elena said softly, her voice guiding her like a gentle beacon. "I have some hot chamomile tea already steeping. It will completely warm you up from the inside out." Margaret followed her, moving slowly down the long carpeted hallway. Her old sensible shoes made absolutely no sound on the thick rugs. They entered a large, incredibly spacious kitchen. The room was bathed in a soft yellow light. A large wooden farmhouse table sat directly in the center. It looked incredibly inviting and perfectly safe. "Please have a seat," Elena offered, gently pulling out a heavy wooden chair. Margaret slowly sat down. She placed her heavy leather purse gently onto the wooden table. Her thin hands were still trembling just a little bit. Elena quickly brought over 2 large ceramic mugs. The hot steam rose beautifully into the warm air. She pushed one mug gently toward Margaret. "Drink this slowly," Elena advised gently, taking a seat directly across from her. "It has a little bit of honey in it. It will help soothe your dry throat." Margaret wrapped her cold, fragile fingers completely around the warm ceramic. She took a tiny, hesitant sip. The sweet, warm liquid felt incredibly comforting. She closed her pale eyes, letting out a long, shaky breath. For the very first time in an incredibly long time, she allowed herself to completely relax her rigid shoulders. She opened her eyes, looking directly at her heavy purse. She slowly reached out, unzipping the main compartment. She carefully pulled out the old leather-bound book. She placed it gently on the wooden table. Elena watched her quietly, absolutely not interrupting her private moment. Margaret slowly opened the heavy cover. She turned a few yellowed pages, and there, tucked safely inside, was the crisp paper bus ticket. It was a one-way ticket straight to Albuquerque. She stared at it for a very long, quiet moment. That small piece of paper had been her only desperate lifeline for 6 long months. It was a silent, hidden promise that she could eventually escape her son's violent temper. "I bought this," Margaret whispered softly, her voice barely breaking the quiet room. "I bought this ticket 6 months ago. I hid it in my purse. Every single day I told myself I would finally leave, but I never actually did. I was entirely too terrified." Elena nodded slowly, her kind eyes full of deep, profound understanding. "Fear is a very heavy chain, Margaret. It completely paralyzes you. It makes you believe that you absolutely deserve the terrible things happening to you. But you did not need the ticket tonight. You found the incredible courage to ask for real help." Margaret lightly touched the paper ticket with her trembling fingertips. "I did not find the courage," she admitted honestly, a fresh tear forming in her eye. "Leo completely found it for me. If he had not seen those dark bruises, I would be sitting in my cold car right now. I would be driving directly back into that terrible nightmare." She slowly closed the heavy book, completely hiding the ticket once again. She pushed it gently to the side of the table. She absolutely did not need it anymore. She was finally safe. Meanwhile, nearly 20 miles away, the dark, suffocating nightmare was just waking up. Back in Red Rock Springs, the small rundown house was incredibly cold. The heating system was completely broken, and Thomas had absolutely refused to pay the expensive repair bill. The freezing desert wind rattled the thin, single-pane windows violently. The entire house felt exactly like an icebox. Thomas Thornton groaned loudly. He shifted his heavy weight violently on the old saggy living room sofa. His head pounded fiercely, a terrible agonizing reminder of the cheap whiskey he had drank earlier that night. He slowly opened his bloodshot eyes. The room was completely dark, lit only by the faint yellow glow of the distant street lamp outside. He sat up heavily, rubbing his rough hands aggressively over his face. He felt a deep, familiar surge of hot anger immediately rise in his chest. He was always angry when he woke up. He was angry about his massive debts. He was angry about his failed business. He was angry at the entire unfair world. And usually, he took all of that explosive anger directly out on the only person who was always there. "Mom!" Thomas yelled loudly. His harsh, grating voice echoed sharply through the small, quiet house. He waited for exactly 5 seconds. He fully expected to hear the familiar, nervous sound of her soft slippers shuffling quickly down the hallway. He fully expected her to come rushing into the room nervously, offering him a glass of water or a quiet apology for absolutely no reason at all. But complete silence answered him. He heavily swung his legs completely off the sofa. His bare feet hit the cold hardwood floor with a loud thud. "Mom!" he shouted again. His voice much louder and far more aggressive this time. He stood up, stumbling slightly in the dark. He completely ignored the large pile of unopened red final notice envelopes scattered across the kitchen counter. He walked heavily down the narrow, dark hallway. The wooden floorboards creaked loudly beneath his massive weight. He reached the closed door of Margaret's small bedroom. He did not knock gently. He absolutely never knocked. He aggressively grabbed the brass doorknob, twisting it violently, and pushed the heavy door completely open. The door hit the wall with a loud, sharp bang. "Are you completely deaf?" Thomas snarled angrily, stepping fully into the freezing room. He reached out blindly, flipping the cheap plastic light switch on the wall. The harsh overhead light flickered violently to life. It instantly illuminated the small, incredibly neat bedroom. Thomas completely froze. The words died entirely in his dry throat. The small, single bed was perfectly made. The soft floral quilt was neatly tucked in. The pillows were completely smooth. There was absolutely no dent on the mattress. The room was perfectly and entirely empty. He blinked rapidly, his bloodshot eyes darting quickly around the small space. He checked the tiny open closet. He saw her old sensible dresses hanging perfectly straight, but her thick blue wool coat was completely missing. He checked the small wooden dresser. Her heavy leather purse was completely gone. A sudden, entirely foreign feeling completely washed over him. It was not his usual explosive rage. It was a cold, sharp spike of absolute panic. "Where the hell are you?" he muttered softly to himself, his voice dropping to a dangerous, deadly whisper. He quickly spun around, marching aggressively back down the hallway. He checked the small, cold bathroom. He checked the dark, empty kitchen. He even opened the heavy front door, looking completely out into the freezing driveway. Her old faded blue sedan was completely missing. Thomas gripped the wooden doorframe incredibly tightly. His knuckles turned entirely white, exactly the same way Margaret's knuckles had turned white in the diner parking lot. His mind raced frantically. Where could she possibly go at 3 a.m? She absolutely had no friends. She had completely stopped talking to the neighbors months ago. She had absolutely no money of her own. He had made entirely sure of that. He slammed the heavy front door completely shut. The loud noise shook the entire fragile house. His cold panic rapidly transformed completely back into a hot, violent fury. She had actually left. She had dared to leave him alone in this freezing, broken house. She had completely taken his absolute control away. "You cannot hide from me!" Thomas hissed angrily, his dark eyes narrowing into dangerous, violent slits. "I will absolutely find you, and when I do, you are going to be incredibly sorry." He immediately rushed over to the small kitchen counter. He grabbed his cheap plastic cell phone, dialing her number frantically. He listened to it ring again and again until the automated voicemail finally picked up. He did not leave a message. He simply hung up, dialed again, and let his absolute explosive rage completely take over. The quiet, desperate game of hide-and-seek had officially begun, and Thomas was absolutely determined to win. The freezing desert wind howled violently against Leo's heavy leather jacket. He rode his massive black motorcycle completely alone into the pitch-black night. He was heading rapidly straight back toward the small, sleeping town of Red Rock Springs. His mind was incredibly sharp and totally focused. The rescue mission was absolutely not over yet. He had safely delivered Margaret to Elena's secure ranch, but there was still one massive, highly dangerous loose end. Margaret's old faded blue sedan was still sitting quietly in the dark parking lot of the Starlight Diner. It was a massive glowing beacon. If her angry son Thomas found that car, he would absolutely tear the entire diner completely apart. He would brutally interrogate Betty, the young waitress. He would completely terrorize innocent people. Leo absolutely could not let that happen. He twisted the heavy throttle aggressively. The loud roaring engine pushed the heavy bike much faster. The dark, jagged shapes of the desert mountains flew rapidly past him.